Assalamu alaikum. The lecture we will have now will be titled Islamic Art from Spain. The idea of this lecture series is to pick up on some of the ideas we discussed in the last lecture as to the formation of art in Europe, the ideas of identity, style, and of course the influences or ideas that were coming from the East, or notably the Muslims. So when we look at the general wealth of study coming from the field of Islamic Spain, it tends to be focused on what you can classify as a kind of romantic lure, meaning this kind of exotic East, even from Muslim publications, this kind of a haven for a lot of creativity and a beautiful era of life where there were Jews and Christians and Muslims who lived together. And in so far we can say it is true. But the issue which I want to really talk about in this lecture with you is how we can understand some of these concepts into the later formation years, which tend to be left out a lot. A lot of the material focuses on the early conquest of the Muslims from the 8th century all the way till the 15th century when the Muslims departed from Spain. Instead, what this lecture will look at will be focused on the actual formation towards the end of the period of the Muslims. So when we look at Islamic art or architecture from Spain, as you see in the first image, it's a building from Seville. It's a very contemporary building, only built in the 1914. It's a museum of art in Seville, and if you look at the style, you'll see that it's notably Eastern. The kind of archway windows, the kind of brickwork used, the kind of roof tiles. It's mimicking a kind of presence which actually should have left Spain many centuries before. So the real question that I want to get at today is what was the lasting impact of Muslims in Spain, and how did much of the influence survive through other names? It wasn't given the name of Islamic art, but it was given other names. And it'll really be helpful for students to go through the early glossary and see some of the terms that we're going to be tackling today. It will really help with understanding the kind of issues, because post-reconquest of Spain, well, reconquest I mean when, again, it's a political term which we have to use because this is what history is using. And so it is very difficult, but we will try and keep on par with this. Reconquest means the reconquest of the Christians from taking the land back from the Muslims. It was an idea that was brought about called the Reconquesta, and it stayed through in the history books, and we will have to just do as much as we can and see where we can open the course for debate. So just to begin the lecture, what I will do is I will begin on just a brief introduction, just summing up the kind of events that happened during the Muslim period of Spain, which lasted around 800 years, from 711, when Tariq bin Ziyad landed on the rocks at Gibraltar, which funnily enough takes its name from Jabal Tariq, meaning the rock of Tariq. And it's interesting how these names have survived over time. And so we will pick up from there, and then we will go through with the list of events. And you will see in your handouts there are two timelines. One is given for a list of Muslim events and the progression of the Muslim political impact. So you have the Emirate of Cordoba, the Caliphate of Cordoba, you have the various Taifa states were smaller states broken away from the main artery of Muslim stronghold, if you like, and became almost independent rules. So on one side I've given you the list of the Muslim timeline, and on the other side you have general political events taking place. For example, towards the end you have the unity of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, which ousted the Muslims from Spain. You also have the banning of Arabic, which happened a few years prior to that. There are certain events, so I've split this into two separate timelines because it's important to understand what is happening from within the Muslim stronghold and what is happening around at that time in the territory. And it's also quite important, or quite good to know, the history of what was also happening in France and Europe and the formation of, at that time, which came to be called the new ideals which would unite Europe together. And again, it created the other and the we, which we already spoke about a little bit in the last lecture. Between this period of 711 and 1492, it would be wrong to say it's a continuous struggle, but we can say that when we look at it towards the end, it was a break away from the central stronghold of the Umayyads, if you like, and the Muslims were pushing and towing on land and who could capture and regain which city and which areas. We do know, of course, that the Muslims in Spain, they were a branch from the Umayyad dynasty, which held its stronghold in Damascus. But the problem was that with the center in Damascus, authority could not be controlled in one region. So eventually the Muslims in Spain split and of course became the Caliphate of Cordoba, which Cordoba, we will come on to a little bit later, was renowned for its glories and heyday. And you'll find many books talking about Cordoba being a great center for learning, a great seat of knowledge, and interestingly enough, it's also given the privilege of being one of the first universities to have influenced the establishment of Oxford University in the UK. So Cordoba was not only just interesting as a seat of learning, but also as a seat of inspiration that drew from the Muslim world and brought many new things into Europe. For example, one of the famous technological innovations was the reuse of aqueducts. Muslims had learned from the existing culture, the Roman aqueduct culture, and they incorporated this into their cities. And one particular method they used was the system of qanats. And this is an old tradition which we can go back into Muslim land. Some say it came from Persia and others say it came from elsewhere. Well, this was a way of drawing water from the hillside into the city. It was a way of you dig holes one by one, you tap into the water table along a line leading from the hilltop to the city. And with these zones, you're rising the water table at each level. By digging into the water table, which is generally, you could say, horizontal, you're raising it enough so it flows in a channel underground to the settlement area, which is a very unique innovation at the time. It allowed a lot of crop harvesting. It allowed there to be a lot of progression in a society that relies a lot on its own growth and on growth and production, you can say. Rather than dwelling too much on this idea of what the Muslims brought to Spain and how the convivencia was, which was the mutual agreement between the Jews and the Christians and Muslims, which is always glorified, and it is a very beautiful part of history to read about. And I will leave that for the students to go away and read up and have a prior knowledge, because it's very difficult to develop this kind of further understanding, which I want to get to if I'm having time to explain these early concepts. So it is important to understand these initial ideas and to get a background study on Islamic Spain. I would really recommend the documentary by the BBC, When the Moors Ruled Europe. It will be a really good way, again, of getting the background study, which will lead into some of the ideas that we will be discussing now. What this lecture would have shown to students is that the kind of studies surrounding Spain are not so simple as they may seem. We sometimes think we know when we mention Islamic art, or we think we know when we speak about European art, but the terminologies are interestingly not so arbitrary to the political events that were taking place at the time. Muslims existed in Spain for 800 years. They were part and parcel of the evolutionary culture which existed in Spain. And it was not part of an Islamic caliphate, because it broke away from the Umayyads as early as they could. And Spain reached a period of great achievements. But after the Muslims and the expulsion of Muslims, or near to the expulsion of Muslims, this term Mudehar art and architecture creeps in. It homogenizes the arts from the minarets to the synagogues to the churches, all under one kind of banner. It creates a distance between us and them. It makes it very difficult to look at Spain with an objective view and understand what really Islam did influence in Spain. It also plays on the idea of a superior new European thought, the idea that European art and European history evolved from something which was completely separate from the East. It doesn't realize the kind of culture which grew in Spain from the influence of the Muslims. I hope this lecture for students will give them the chance to understand themselves as part of a European continuum, as part and parcel of the history that led to its formation. The idea, the new ideas of Europe, the Renaissance, the great ideals that we all live in, these were not separate from the history that we see of Islam and the history of the Muslims that lived in the regions. So when we look at the history of Islam in centers like Spain, Italy, the Balkans and so forth, we realize that Islam was part of the historic formation. When we scratch beneath the surfaces of the formation of church architecture, Romanesque values to Renaissance, we find that it was not so polarized as it may seem. A lot of attention has been given to Islamic Spain. It has glorified the past, there's been romantic ideals, there's been a lot of attention on what the Muslims did and what they were. But this kind of attitude has led to this idea of a cultural survival. It's this idea that we were there, but then we are not there. What really we need to look at, as I mentioned in one of my earlier lectures, is the idea of cultural choice. We have to understand that historically there were choices made in the artistic sense that were not part of cultural survival. But these were choices made by the religious establishments and in the social realm too. And because of this, we have seen that the art and heritage of Spain, it has included the elements from the Muslim world. But it is definitely aided to a kind of academic inquiry. For example, the word Mozarab, or the word Mudéjar, or the word Moresco. These were terms given to different groups of people. So, if you were a Jew or a Christian who was speaking Arabic or under an Arab dominion, the word was given as a Mozarab or Moresco. Or this other term, Mudéjar, could be a Muslim who was working under the patron of a non-Muslim. But the issue with these terms, and particularly with this term Mudéjar, is it is led to a kind of one-sided understanding of the arts of Spain, because what happened was, after even the post-Reconquest, a lot of the art which became mildly referenced as being Eastern or Muslim became understood as being Mudéjar. It may not have been a Muslim artist, and it may well have been a Christian artist, but it was called Mudéjar. Even the term Mudéjar is actually a very political statement, because the word dejar itself means to leave in Spanish. So those who left, it's bringing along ideas of Muslims having to leave Spain and those who stayed behind to work under the Christians. But then there's another side of the equation, there's another side of the argument, which is saying that Mudéjar also means to domesticate. So the idea of Mudéjar may have construed to mean to domesticate, the domesticated Arab or the domesticated Muslim. So it brings upon a very derogatory term. It's almost like having a domesticated pet. A pet, somebody who's inferior, but he's able to live amongst you. So this idea of Mudéjar, it's interesting where it came from, and it's a lot of debate around it, but the point to mention at this time is it's misconstrued a lot of understandings, and made it very difficult for us to break into what really happened in this time, and especially after the Muslims had to leave. It's allowed us not to understand the art of Muslim Spain as part of the social formation. What it's done again is it's polarized the art. It's made the art seem like it was not really part of the Spanish Peninsula. It was not really part of the inherent culture there. It was something which was foreign, and the term Mudéjar makes sure that it was not part of Christendom or Europe. This is one of the another problems we have with Islamic Spain, is that how do we approach to study the art? And it kind of spells back to the early questions we had in the lecture on Islamic art in Europe. How do we approach Islamic art? Is it an art produced by a Muslim in Muslim lands? Or are we attributing our own values of we understand today on Islamic art to a point in the past? So when we look at Islamic Spain, again, should we understand this art as part of a Spanish culture that happened to be Muslim? Or was it a Muslim culture that was based in Spain? These are the kind of issues that historians face, and no matter what kind of study it is, it always has this kind of background bias. And it's very difficult to find a study of this kind of history which can really do justice to the heritage and art of this region. Which is why I don't want to spend so much time looking at the places of Cordoba, the cities of Seville, the cities of light, There is so much one could talk about, but it doesn't do justice to the formation of art, which again I want to talk about. I want to talk about Europe, the formation from Spain, the effects it had, and why it had some of these effects. So this term mudehar, or the art of the Muslims, which was the term given after the expulsion of the Muslims, we can say the high point in the mudehar period of art was, you can say, 13th, 14th century onwards. It's a complex kind of understanding, but generally there are certain stylistic categories that historians have given to this kind of art. For example, it's the use of brick, the use of clay brick, the kind of brickwork, interlaced brickwork. And we see this in many kind of buildings, and especially the building which we saw at the start of the lecture in Seville, which was only 150 years old, but it still has very strong influences borrowed from the Muslim past. So the issue is, actually, we need to understand the formation of art in Spain as part of a cultural choice rather than a cultural survival. And this is very important, because if we are understanding art as part of a cultural survival, something survived in Spain, it doesn't make it part of the inherent construction of that place. Whereas if we look at Mudehar and a lot of these buildings, and including the one I showed at the start, and some of the churches we will come on to look at as part of a cultural choice, the fact that the Christians or even Jews in their synagogues, which we will see, chose to build their buildings in this style, it means that the Spanish identity was tied to the Muslim past, and we can't disassociate one from the other. And it does away again with these polarized understandings of history and again, arts from the Muslim world, which have been very problematic for historians, as I mentioned before. And we will see a bit more when we come onto the cathedrals, because the images are quite striking, and it's quite obvious that these choices that were made by the patrons or even the religious authorities, with the kind of churches we will see and the kind of synagogues, they were cultural choices. They were choices that were made by using Muslim art. Either they were Muslim artisans, Muslim craftsmen, or they were Christians who worked in the Muslim style. To make a comparison of the kind of zone that Spain was, it's classified as a kind of frontier zone. Frontier zone is many similarities we can see in Central Asia up until the 16th century, 13th century Anatolia, and 12th century Sicily, parts of which you've already discussed already. These zones were ideas of what we call transculturalism, meaning where ideas flowed in different directions, and both on the externality and within the culture. So this hybrid idea of transculturalism we see spread throughout the Al-Andalus region. Al-Andalus region, we could say the majority of Spain, from the 10th century through to, let's say, the 12th to 13th century, there were many buildings with such kind of references. If we look at the Bab al-Mardan building in Toledo, it was initially built on the remains of an old Visigothic church, which again brings out the idea about the Muslims reusing the history and making their mosques or making their construction as part of the inherent culture or the inherent building that were there at the time. This building, later in 1190, was recaptured by the Christians and it was converted into a church. But what's striking and quite interesting is that the Christians, after recapturing this region and converting it to a church, they continued the same tradition which they'd seen from the Muslims. So it was not a case of defacing the interior and so forth. It was a case of continuing the exact same style. So they continued the kind of brickwork, the kind of calligraphy inside the building. So if we look at the visual continuity of this building, we see interesting Arabic inscriptions above the frame archways, much like the 10th century mosque in Cordoba. And again, the mosque in Cordoba was a major influential point for many other buildings, including minarets which were constructed after it. The inscriptions above the archways says Al-Iqbal, prosperity, and Al-Yum, good fortune, placed in a jumble of letters, some legible, some illegible above the doorways. But again, this idea of pseudo-Kufic or pseudo-calligraphy is something which is again coming to light. Many people may argue that they didn't know what they were writing. Some people would say that they knew exactly what it meant, but because it was the idea that all the faiths they did not contradict. So the idea of good fortune or good prosperity could be seen in either way. And it was not a case of East and West, Islam versus Christendom, but we see more a kind of a secularization of art forms, if I can call it that. So meaning I can borrow from the Muslim tradition as long as it's not conflicting with my tradition. And of course, with the Muslim tradition not having any iconography and so forth, it made it much easier for these buildings to progress and be restored or rebuilt by the Christians in the same style. So now we are going to look at two synagogues. Both will be very interesting and will cast some light on a little bit further than what we've already seen in the previous case study with the church and the visual continuity. The first is the Santa Maria Blanca synagogue, and the second is the Samuel Halini Abulafia synagogue in 1360. In the Santa Maria synagogue, we see interesting kind of decor. We see the stucco work with the capitals, with vegetal ornaments. It's very similar, if you look, to a mosque architecture. The mosque plan is also still very visible. The synagogue's design was laid out as a mosque, and then it was very easy just converted into a synagogue. So the internal structure also remained the same. The Abulafia synagogue, which the image is very striking, you'll see again the kind of style and the ornament, and it's a very complex kind of abstract geometry that's used. The kind of archways, the columns, it's really mimicking a style which it's very hard to not say that it's from the Muslim. It's also covered in a series of inscriptions in Hebrew and Arabic. The Hebrew inscriptions, strangely enough, are actually like poems. So now there's a tradition of poems entering into the religious sphere. And we see this actually in the Alhambra, which is in Granada, much later on. But it's the idea of culture now. Now we are touching, we've gone from religious borrowing now to cultural borrowing. So now the idea of poetry, which ran very central to the Muslim culture there in Spain also, is now finding its way into synagogues too. So essentially what we can already derive from these examples, from the church and the synagogues, is that this secularization of art forms was not just in the religious sphere, but also in the tradition. And in fact, when we look at Spain, it's very hard to take the two apart, the religious and the tradition. And one could easily argue that the Muslim religion was part of the fabric of the tradition of Spain. So around the 12th century, we have the coming of what we call the Romanesque art and architecture from the north. This was essentially a way of uniting Europe under one banner. And it was coming from France down and invading into the old Al-Andalus territories. But what remains interesting now for historians is, if you like, the battle of these ideas, where the old inherent style from the Mudéjars is still being held on by many of these territories, and then from the north you have this Romanesque style creeping in, and at times one is being preferred over the other. So around the 12th century we have this creeping in from the Romanesque style from the Cluniac churches of the north, as in the French region, which was percolating in south, and you have the Muslim Spain known as Al-Andalus, which by now was under Almohad dominion. Now, the Almohad and Almoravids, these were the two, one of the two final dominions of Muslim Spain, we could say. They were actually Berber tribes from North Africa, and they were, if you like, the last organized unity that we have in Muslim Spain. But what is interesting in terms of art history and architecturally is that now we're beginning to see a melting pot of two different styles. We have this kind of Romanesque, almost Renaissance proportions coming, combined with a very Eastern Islamic style of deco. We see this in the facade of the University of Salamanca. This is an early 16th century facade, but what's interesting is it has very Renaissance-like proportions with complete kind of mudehar, or what you can term arabesque style ornamentation all over the facade. So it's a blend of two, if you like. It's a compromise that's being made. And it's interesting because it kind of shows once again the coming of new identities and the kind of tradition which is becoming so hard for the Spanish South, or Spain in general actually, to do away with. This kind of style actually, funnily, became to be known as a plateresque style. And what we termed later on the neo-mudehar. What happened was, with the arrival of Europeans into the New World, which was the Spanish colonies of Mexico and so forth, this style was later transported, if you like, and then rebuilt into churches there. So this neo-mudehar was the new mudehar. But notice the terminology is still the same, the idea of a mudehar. It is a Muslim working under non-Muslim patronages. But it doesn't make sense because 16th century there are no Muslims there. But yet these kind of terminologies is still making it problematic for us to understand what is happening. So what we have is this Spanish tradition which has gained so much for 800 years of Islamic influence versus these very strong yokes of European identity in the form of Romanesque and churches and Renaissance, which were coming in and trying to fuse their way in. But the problem which really haunts art historians is this idea of, again, what was classical and what was non-classical. The classical became known as you may or have already guessed from the previous lecture, those kind of styles which are in conformity with the new ideals of Europe. And those kind of styles which weren't were simply not part of the new identity of Europe. So the Mudehars survived and stayed as artisans and craftsmen from 15th through 16th. 16th century was when it really began to diminish. All across Europe actually, local vernacular styles were being abandoned for more of an international style, you can imagine. And as I've already mentioned, the kind of international style was one which was in line with the new movements of the church, or the new movements of a united Christendom and Renaissance. So it's interesting when we look at the Mudehars and the formation. It wasn't until 1609 and 1612, with the final expulsion, that it was completely, almost completely eradicated. This is as Mudehar in the academic sense of the term that's used in academic studies. Mudehar was finally finished. And it was a kind of, the Spanish Inquisition and the need to rid Spain of its past played on the narratives of new Spanish kingdom for many centuries, even after the expulsion of Muslims from Spain in 1492. It did play after that. They were still trying to get rid of this past, which seemed to, unfortunately and ironically, they were trying to rid it, it was part of its own formation. And although academic study will say that the final expulsion of Moriscos now, these are even Christians who maybe they spoke Arabic or someone, anybody who's suspected or anything suspected of foreign was expelled from Spain. It continued, but not in the same kind of terms. Now Mudehar or Neo-Mudehar or whatever you want to call it, continued in a different light. It continued under the guise of, you could say, the new terminology that Europe gave it. And some would argue that the Romanesque style, which came from France and Renaissance, was heavily influenced by the Mudéjar. Something we come to understand when we look at Mudéjar art and architecture, from Spain in particular, it helps us to understand a bit more about Islamic art and the legacy of Islamic art. The real Islamic art and its connection to the Islamic way of thinking and doing things. And this is true if we really begin to look at the kind of clues that Mudéjar art leaves us. But before we come on to understand this, I will just give one more example, a beautiful example, and maybe one of the most prominent examples today in the southern region of Spain. This is in the city of Seville, and this tower, or minaret as it used to be, is still actually there today. It was part of the great mosque of Seville, which was initially destroyed, but the new Christians, they kept this part of the tower. They kept this tower because it was a deliberate act and they felt they could incorporate it as part of their new cathedral, or simply the tower was an aesthetic interest and it was something which was acclimatized to the city. And this word acclimatized is quite key here, because initially when the Muslims had constructed this tower, it was constructed by the Almohads in the 12th century, and it was designed by the architect Ibn Basu, and it was a part of a triad of towers, one being in the Qutubiyya minaret in Marrakesh, the other one being the Hassan Tower in Rabat in northern Morocco. Now, what's interesting and why the word acclimatized is so important here is that the Muslims didn't just come to Al-Andalus or Seville and just copy and paste a design which they were already familiar with from North Africa into Seville. They actually incorporated the local tradition and culture into this new tower they built. And as we already know, and that they're already familiar in doing, they actually built it on old Roman ashlars. And if you visit this site today and you go to the base of the tower, you will really see these old stones that were placed at the base level of the minaret. Again, an idea of the Muslims continuing and appropriating the past. It was a continuation of a culture. It was not a new culture coming to destroy and to gain a political hegemony as it could be suggested, but it was part of a continuation of the style. And we see this in Andalusi style in the music and the poetry. Andalusi music formed in the 12th century as being a very regionalized kind of music coming from Al-Andalus, meaning it was not North African, it was not Berber, it was not essentially European, France or so on, but it was Andalusian music. And the poetry too. So this idea of acclimatizing is quite key to understanding Islamic art here. So what do we know about this kind of architecture in the latter period of the Muslim expulsion, what we're terming Mudéjar here, from the Alcazar of Seville, which I haven't spoke about so much, but again, it has a very strong influence in literature, and I would recommend my students to go away and read up on this, from the towers of Teruel to the tower of to the La Giralda Tower in Seville, which I've only recently just mentioned, the one which was initially a minaret converted to a mosque, and of course the synagogues which we studied earlier. What do all of these buildings have in common? How can we understand them all to be Mudéjar? And what can we learn from this? Actually, the key to understanding these is what I mentioned only a moment ago in the Tower of Seville, or the La Giralda as it's called today. It's this idea of the appropriation and the assimilation that the Muslims continued as part of their artistic endeavor. It was the idea that they learned from the existing tradition and they transformed it. If you like, they took the indigenous tradition and they made it vernacular, meaning they learned from the past and they reappropriated it into a new direction. Or, as Oleg Grabar, a famous art historian, has said, it was giving meaning to old forms that had lost their value. And if we think about Islam and the concept of Islam, this is exactly what it comes down to. It's coming down to just realigning something. It's not coming to stampede over previous concepts, but it's just realignment and asking people to that what is universal is there, but Islam just realigns the concept or the subject towards a goal. And it did this, and if we look at the artistic heritage. So if we try to disentangle this history of Spain and we try to give it words and meanings to different periods, actually it makes it very difficult, because essentially we're trying to disentangle a very hybrid world. It's not easy to understand Islamic Spain with the different terminology, the different political events and so forth. But what we can say is that the Mudéjar, or what we would know now is the Islamic influence, or what we could call the resonances of Islamic legacy on Spain, remained all the way through to 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th century in Spain. In the 14th century we have the arrival of a Gothic style in Spain. The Gothic came with ideas again, trying to relate back to God, trying to understand man's nature and the direction. But again, it borrowed much from the Islamic past of Spain. And we see these resonances of the great Mosque of Cordoba, these archways, in many later cathedrals, in the archways and the style that they were decorated in. If we come a little bit more forward now into the 19th century, a little bit closer, it was only until the 19th century in Spain that the religious yoke of the past was beginning to give way, and patrons and artists were able to really explore their trade. So if we come a bit more forward into the 19th century, we begin to see how Spain, away from the yokes of its religious past, it begins to become free to experiment again with its art tradition and history. We begin to see a romantic movement born from the industrial age, and it's interesting how and what kind of precedence the artists now take. And this is, of course, the era when we also see here in the UK, where we see Owen Wilson and William Morris trying to understand the Oriental world. And strangely enough, the kind of art they chose to depict or study was that of the Alhambra in Spain, or the Arabesque, or the Persian style, the Indian style. We know, of course, Gaudi, who is one of the most famous architects in recent history. His early works were heavily influenced by the kind of tiling we see in his work, the kind of fluid geometry that he chooses to portray. And we see this because now this kind of rise of art is allowing the freedom to explore its history. But the issue now is this art is never called Neo-Mudéjar or Mudéjar, but had it been, perhaps it would have been given a more close affiliation to its Islamic past. So what I've done is I prepared for the students in the handouts a definition which better sits with this idea of hybrid Mudéjar art. Mudéjar art was an art that was infused with the transformation and assimilation of ideas that were indigenous to Spain. Now, I'm not going to say it was an Islamic art or a Christian art, because in Spain at the time, the kind of art that was acclimatized was, in fact, yes, it was Islamic. But we should be careful about giving these religious references to types of art which may or may not have been influenced or as part, or want to be recognized as part of a religious idea. The Mudéjar was a kind of art that grew from the materials indigenous to the region. It existed before the coming of Christians, and it existed after the coming of Christians. What this lecture would have shown to students is that the kind of studies surrounding Spain are not so simple as they may seem. We sometimes think we know when we mention Islamic art, or we think we know when we speak about European art, but the terminologies are interestingly not so arbitrary to the political events that were taking place at the time. Muslims existed in Spain for 800 years. They were part and parcel of the evolutionary culture which existed in Spain. And it was not part of an Islamic caliphate because it broke away from the Umayyads as early as they could. And Spain reached a period of great achievements. But after the Muslims and the expulsion of Muslims, or near to the expulsion of Muslims, this term Mudehar art and architecture creeps in. It homogenizes the arts from the minarets to the synagogues to the churches, all under one kind of banner. It creates a distance between us and them. It makes it very difficult to look at Spain with an objective view and understand what really Islam did influence in Spain. It also plays on the idea of a superior new European thought, the idea that European art and European history evolved from something which was completely separate from the East. It doesn't realize the kind of culture which grew in Spain from the influence of the Muslims. I hope this lecture for students will give them the chance to understand themselves as part of a European continuum, as part and parcel of the history that led to its formation. The idea, the new ideas of Europe, the Renaissance, the great ideals that we all live in, these were not separate from the history that we see of Islam and the history of the Muslims that lived in the regions. So when we look at the history of Islam in centers like Spain, Italy, the Balkans and so forth, we realize that Islam was part of the historic formation. When we scratch beneath the surfaces of the formation of church architecture, Romanesque values to Renaissance, we find that it was not so polarized as it may seem. A lot of attention has been given to Islamic Spain. It has glorified the past, there's been romantic ideals, there's been a lot of attention of what the Muslims did and what they were. But this kind of attitude has led to this idea of a cultural survival. It's this idea that we were there, but then we are not there. What really we need to look at, as I mentioned in one of my earlier lectures, is the idea of cultural choice. We have to understand that historically there were choices made in the artistic sense that were not part of cultural survival. But these were choices made by the religious establishments and in the social realm too. And because of this, we have seen that the art and heritage of Spain has included the elements from the Muslim world. Thank you very much.